Preface. When I first read Magick Without Tears some 10 years ago, I confess it left very little impression on me. It seemed long and tedious to say the least. I suppose I was more accustomed to the dazzling pyrotechnics and virtuosity of the earlier Crowley, to the Equinox and other books of 60 years ago. But my reaction was a serious mistake, as I discovered several years later when the opportunity to read it again presented itself. For despite its wit and humor, Magick Without Tears is a serious, sober, and sophisticated piece of good writing. It dazzles, but in a rather more restrained way than his antecedent work. It requires quiet study and sober meditation to appreciate its scholarship, its profound insight, and its great worth. The letters that comprise this volume were written fairly close to the end of Crowley's life here on Earth. It seems difficult at this writing to realize that he was born almost a century ago, in 1875. Some critics are inclined to believe that he had become feeble minded toward the end, a condition which some felt to be due to the softening of his brain through his use of drugs. He was troubled by emphysema, it is true, brought about by many years of asthma and heavy smoking. Heroin had long been prescribed to manage his bronchial asthma, and because it was about the only medication that gave him relief, permitting him to breathe with some ease, he eventually became addicted. For the benefit of those who would like to believe that his mental faculties had become impaired, I must assert that these letters give lie to that assumption. They are incomparably lucid and well organized. Even his apparent rambling at times had motives aimed solely at the elucidation of obscure points of doctrine and teaching. Beyond all other considerations, these letters prove the inherent clarity and inexorable logic of his thinking. It never fails or falters, even for a single moment. General semantics finds its most staunch supporter in the person and writing of Aleister Crowley. There is hardly a page in this book that does not insist that the inquirer clarify her reference. Letter 28 is a splendid example of this insistence. There are pitifully few occult writers that even know what general semantics is all about. From personal experience of many years ago, I recall one of his constant companions, almost a Bible, was Skeat's etymological dictionary. Here, it is thrust repeatedly under the nose of both the inquirer and the reader. At all times, he seeks to know what you mean by the terms you employ in your questions and statements. By the same token, he demands that you expect no less of him. In this respect, if in no other, this book is priceless. The first few letters with alphabet headings are essentially by way of introduction, setting the pace, as it were, for the later ones. But they are loaded with the most important details concerning the great work, his organization of the AA, and what is expected of the student once he has become a probationer of that order. As soon as the chapter letters are reached, however, one is plunged into intellectual and spiritual depths or heights, which the author struggles to make reasonably clear. The first letter borrows the axioms, theorems, and propositions written from an earlier book, Magick in Theory and Practice. They are certainly worth reviewing and contain more than appears at first sight. The order of the letters does not make for easy reading in the sense of being continuous or consecutive. They could have been rearranged in such a way as to give the reader a more steady and gradual introduction to some highly complex and controversial issues. After due reflection, however, I have decided to leave them in their present order and allow the reader to work out his own approach to their contents. It is suggested that the reader first browse through the book as a whole in order to become familiar with the general nature of the material presented. Do remember that there is a table of contents and an index. Later, the reader could take one letter at a time, dealing with a certain topic, study it, and meditate on whatever sections of that letter seem to warrant it. In this way, I believe, he will obtain a great deal more from this very profound book than if he tried to read it straight through as though it were a novel or an otherwise conventional textbook. Letters, divided here into chapters 6, 7, and 8, are entitled The Three Schools of Magick. They were written to expatiate upon a short quotation from Liber 418, The Vision and the Voice, a series of transcendental experiences based upon Enochian system of magic. Crowley states that they were written by Mr. Gerard Amont, and that he is quoting from that long essay. I met Gerard Amont late in 1928. He was at that time a French journalist who lived and worked in Tunisia, though he came up to Paris every now and again to meet with Crowley. The entire content of this long essay bears entirely too many distinguishing features of Crowley himself for it to have been penned by anyone other than Crowley. It would appear that Crowley was quite willing to have written essays, etc., and where convenient to use either a pseudonym or to let another party take full credit for the writing. I state categorically that Amont was incapable of writing this particular essay. Every phrase, most turns of expression, the very egocentricity of the point of view, the penetrating comprehension of magic and history, are all Crowley's work and none other. If one has studied the numerous works of Crowley and absorbed the uniqueness of his particular viewpoint, the hand of the master himself will be recognized. Finally, I doubt whether he would have been willing to quote at such great length from the writing of any other author for these letters. Many short quotations from several writers are certainly to be found in this volume, but not one of such great length. In a word, Crowley is quoting himself. One of Crowley's personal prejudices is highlighted in a curious way in one of these letters. It relates to color. In a quotation from The Three Schools of Magick, he refers to the stupid attempt by Annie Besant and Bishop Ledbetter to set up Jiddu Krishnamurti as the world leader. Both of these theosophical leaders had made all sorts of preparation for this event, including the organization of special societies and service groups which would do honor to him. Crowley wrote of it, "To make the humiliation more complete, a wretched creature was chosen who, to the most loathsome moral qualities, added the most famous fatuous imbecility, and then blew up. We cannot suppose that humanity is so entirely base as to accept Krishnamurti." To this was added a footnote. This passage was written in 1924. The master Therion arose and smote him. What seemed a menace is now hardly a memory. A more unkind reference could hardly have been made. First of all, Krishnamurti was selected by the two neo-theosophists while still a minor. On what basis, I hardly know. It is quite possible that his boyish vanity may have been flattered by having such fulsome honors and praise heaped upon him. A lengthy reference to this episode was made years earlier in The Equinox, Volume 1, Number 10. There is a section, In Memorandum, John Yarker, which is a record of two meetings of a primitive rite of masonry. The first was to give homage to John Yarker, the sovereign Grand Master General of this rite, who had died on March 20th, 1913. The second protested the attendance of an unnamed follower of Ledbetter, though his name is more than hinted at, a follower who, quote, is not and never was a member of a lodge in good standing working under a grand lodge of free and accepted Masons. The sanctuary must be purged. He is not even a free man, but the hired tool of a woman. This woman, pollution to that pure word, comes to us from the nauseous fraud by which she made herself the real, if not the nominal mistress of the TS. This is the secret object of the attempt to hold the election of SGMG without due notice, to drag our holy right into the mire, to chain it to the chariot wheels of a Krishnamurti, to make us panders to the antique and impotent uncleanness of a senile sodomite. Apart from the contempt exuded in this speech, there is an amusing and hypocritical element to be detected here that should not be lost in the shuffle. By his own admission, Crowley was, if not an overt homosexual deviant, then a person who had a powerful homosexual component in his character structure. His strictures against Ledbetter as an old sodomite are, to say the least, evidence that he was dishonest and unscrupulous where it suited his purpose, regardless of any peculiarities inherent in his own personality. It is the pot calling the kettle black. The Baggy Muater, one of the books Crowley wrote sometime during 1914, is nothing else but a textbook of homosexual and deviant practices hidden under the mask of Sufi mysticism. That is Crowley's business, not mine. But if then he attacks another person on the grounds of homosexuality, his hypocrisy stands out like a sore thumb and will win him but little support. I hold no brief for Bishop Ledbetter, believe me. My own condemnation of him rests not on the grounds that he was an old sod or a bugger, but that he, together with Mrs. Besant, was responsible for the thoroughgoing betrayal of the Theosophical movement and for the perversion of Blavatsky's original teachings. Crowley has slung the not very salubrious term ninja around with far too much carelessness. And one place he has used this word where Krishnamurti is concerned, which is a nasty piece of Anglo-Saxon assumption of superiority. And for the Black people in this country, his racist prejudices are far too evident to leave one comfortable. Following the speech quoted from the Equinox, Volume 1, Number 10, there is an account of the legal proceedings in Chingleput, India, where J. Narayaniya was suing Annie Besant to regain custody of his two sons, one of whom was Krishnamurti. Of the latter, the father said, "The boy was not able to write a decent English letter, and so, of course, was incapable of writing the book At the Feet of the Master, which was said to have been his creation. The father believed, as so many people have, that it was authored by Ledbetter." The fact remains that when Krishnamurti came to maturity, he repudiated both Besant and Ledbetter, as well as the various organizations that had been formed to worship him, as well as to further his cause as world teacher. For this alone, he commands vast respect, if nothing more. It required great courage to step down voluntarily from a role originally foisted upon him, and which he came to realize he was unfit to fulfill. Since that day, he has evidenced a loathing for organizations, for societies of the kind of the Theosophical Society, and has espoused a free philosophic attitude that is reminiscent of Zen Buddhism at its best. He has lectured on many occasions throughout the world and has several books to his credit that have been thought to be both profound and wise. Crowley's condemnation is cruel and harsh, perhaps because of his own ambition to be Logos Aeonos, the word of the Aeon, the world teacher, and so he was a ruthless competitor who damned all other competition, real or otherwise. The readers should notice that every letter begins and ends with a formula, two quotations from the Book of the Law. Crowley felt compelled to open every letter and indeed every meeting with any individual with these quotations. Bidding adieu was also marked by the same type of gesture. Some people have felt that he made a laughingstock of himself by so doing, but for this kind of reproach, he cared nothing. So long as he felt commanded by that book to behave in such a manner, he proceeded to do so, come what may. The verses used are, "Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law," and "Love is the law, love under will." The command is to be found in the 3rd chapter of Liber Legis. "And to each man and woman that thou meetest, were it but to dine or to drink at them, it is the law to give. Then they shall chance to abide in this bliss or no, it is no odds." He adapted these versicles to the exigencies for grace before meals. See letter A for this dialogue. Furthermore, He insisted that each student perform certain exercises and prayers at set times during the day, primarily that the whole pattern of life be thus dedicated to the great work. He coined a phrase, background concentration, for this procedure. It implied that by so doing, a tendency would be initiated toward concentration which would stand the student in good stead when, or as, he approached the problem of teaching the mind to center itself. Letter A gives much of this approach, but the concept is scattered throughout the book. His signature appended to all the letters is always 666. This may require a few words of explanation for the reader who has not read other Crowley books and become familiar with the symbol. Crowley was brought up in a household dominated by the religion of the Plymouth Brethren in England. This is a fundamentalist Christian sect which, among many other things, regarded the Bible literally as the inspired Word of God. Thus, it could not be changed in any way and had to serve as the basis for general daily behavior throughout life. In this household, he was permitted no other literature to read other than the Bible until he was about 12 years of age. Thus, he became steeped in biblical lore, having read it and studied it throughout the years. His mother, in moments of exacerbation no doubt, would call him a beast. With his knowledge of the Bible, it did not take him long to find out about the beast of the book of Revelation, the beast who was Antichrist, the beast whose number was 666. He ultimately identified himself with that beast, without question, aided and abetted by his mother. When the time came to revolt and to turn against the religion of his family, with all the venom and brilliance that he and only he could muster, there could be no alternative but that he had to ally himself with those forces which were opposed to the stupidities his mother stood for. So he became the beast. And since Revelation counted the number of the beast and found it to be 666, the number of a man, he turned all his Cabalistic and philosophical skill in later years towards finding this number in any meaningful way or motto that came his way. Still later, after he had received Liber Legis and was forced, as it were, to obey its precepts, then it was that he began to sign all communications with that significant number. Several of the letters describe a method for studying the Qabalah, which deserves more than casual notice. I'm calling attention to it specifically for fear that otherwise this approach may be overlooked in the mass of new ideas which will be hurled at the student if he is approaching the subject for the first time. The method is one that he started to use shortly after joining the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn when taking under the wing of Alan Bennett, who had become his guru. Wherever he went, he took special notice of any person, object, or event with a view to placing it on the Cabalistic tree of life. Slowly, in this way, he became an adept in using the tree as a referent for all phenomena whatsoever, and so-called stereotype attributions of color, planet, tarot cards, etc., lost their abstract formality and became living things. I want to quote one paragraph from letter F where this method is described. As I walked about, I made a point of attributing everything I saw to its appropriate idea. I would walk out of the door of my house and reflect that door is Daleth and house Beth. Now the word Dob is Hebrew for bear and has the number 6, which refers to the sun. Then you come to the fence of your property, and that is Sheth. Number 8, number of tarot trump 7, which is the chariot. So you begin to look about for your car. Then you come to the street, and the first house you see is number 86, and that is Elohim, and it is built of red brick, which reminds you of Mars and the blasted tower, and so on. As soon as this sort of work, which can be done in quite light-hearted spirit, becomes habitual, you will find your mind running naturally in this direction and will be surprised at your progress. Never let your mind wander from the fact that your Qabalah is not my Qabalah. A good many of the things which I have noted may be useful to you, but you must construct your own system so that it is a living weapon in your hand. The novelist Philip Wiley, many years ago, earned a reputation for himself by the writing of a book entitled A Generation of Vipers, in which he excoriated mothers and motherhood. This was one of many books denouncing so called mother love, laying down the proposition, which has since been enormously elaborated, that this has led to the emasculation of the American male, placing him in emotional servitude to the American matriarchy. The book created an ever widening stir and has left its mark on American literature, or at least the literature of popular psychology. If Freud originally developed the concept of the Oedipus complex at some length, replete with innumerable case histories and paradigms, then Philip Wiley extended it with great power in order to reach the general public. But the most bitter and violent of all attacks on mother love that I am familiar with has emanated from Crowley. His letter 53 has to be read slowly and closely to be fully appreciated. It is far more deadly and vitriolic than anything Freud ever wrote, and much more to the point than Wiley's work. No doubt it is predicated on the bad relationship he had with his own mother, of whom he has written at length in The Confessions of Aleister Crowley. I have elaborated upon this in a rather different direction and with other details in the book The Eye and the Triangle. Magick Without Tears is chock full of descriptions of unusual things, strange events, weird people, and stories which make for fascinating reading. Much of the material, for example, about the history as well as the possible application of Liber Legis, is so extraordinary as almost to deserve extrapolation to form a small book by itself. There is one story briefly mentioned in Letter 80, which Crowley must have written years earlier, though the manuscript has been lost and I have never seen any reference to it outside of this book, entitled Every Precaution. It packs sufficient dramatic wallop to excite some novelists enough to do a short story on it. Other stories are gruesome, like that of the woman cheese rat murders toward the end of the volume, which are ghoulish and almost incredible to most of us who lead more prosaic lives. Anecdotes relative to his wide travels and variety of experiences render this a unique piece of reading material. Finally, his descriptions of magic and yoga, seemingly contradictory approaches to self discovery, their resemblances and differences, are among the most lucid and illuminating, to say nothing of being provocative, that I have ever seen anywhere at any time. I cannot help but feel that the beginner in these studies, as well as the advanced student, will discover in these letters a veritable mine of important information and an encyclopedia of occult learning not to be found elsewhere. Though the title of the book may be amusing, the contents are far from being so. Crowley's reputation as a writer and teacher of the greatest magnitude must be enhanced by these letters, which are thus strongly recommended to all those who seek the light. There are some magnificent flashes of profundity in this book, as when Crowley examines the necessity of keeping a diary, a personal record of all practices undertaken. A great deal of what we know about him is due to the fact that he kept a diary throughout his life. Most of these are intact and have been preserved, thanks to the scrupulousness and care of Mr. Gerald York, to whom posterity will have much to be thankful for. Only a few sections have been lost due to Crowley's constant moving from pillar to post and the carelessness of those around him. Anyway, he offers some meaningful suggestions when he considers the diary in relationship to the magical memory. He is far clearer and more provocative on this subject than he has ever been before. Again, these insights are confined to no one particular letter, but are scattered through all of them. The interested student could keep several notebooks, each devoted to some particular subject, such as the magical memory. In this way, he could prepare several very interesting notebooks on specific magical topics based on this particular work. Some reviewers in this country of The Confessions of Aleister Crowley have likened him to a Victorian hippie because he was unconventional in his sex life, experimented freely with drugs, and dressed exotically at times. He has been pictured as the prototype of the modern hippie. There appears at first to be some justification for this identification, provided one does not examine the thesis too closely. But dig deeper, and the resemblance falls apart altogether. There is enough data presented in this striking set of letters, apart from anything else the man has written in his long literary life, to thoroughly destroy any such possibility. A bohemian and eccentric he may well have been. A hippie, never. Many of the young people of today are turning toward his writing with a view to resolving some of the most serious problems of our time, conflicts which affect them and our society most seriously. In this, I think they are showing some deep wisdom. But in many of their overt attitudes and behavior, it seems as if they are missing the boat entirely. This is why it is imperative that they become familiar with the tenets of these letters, to make them part and parcel of their own mental and spiritual equipment. They may find a variety of answers or suggestions which, if followed, could result in a transformation of their lives and those of succeeding generations. 1. For sloppiness and untidiness, Crowley had absolutely no use. Only when on expeditions of one kind or another did he ever look grimy or untidy. Otherwise, he was fastidious to a degree, and proud of it. Not that he was compulsive or an exponent of conforming to social dictates or the arbitrary whims of current fashion. Far from it. He was violently opposed to such conformist attitudes, a true rebel toward that as to almost everything else. 2. Like many of today's generation, he used drugs. He had experimented with many psychedelic agents, with some that are totally unfamiliar to our young folk today. Because of Alan Bennett's asthma, drugs were experimented with to experience relief from the bronchial paroxysms and dyspnea. An incidental and not anticipated effect at first was the psychedelic effect, the inadvertent experience of mystical states of consciousness. These occurred, I am inclined to believe, not merely because of the effect of the drug, but because Alan was mystically inclined and because he had already undergone serious magical training in the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. Whatever knowledge Alan had attained about pharmacology was passed on to the disciple, Aleister Crowley, when he came under the tutelage of Alan. The result was that, long before he in turn developed asthma, he conducted experiments with a wide variety of drugs in order to determine whether by their means a door could be opened or held open to higher mystical states. But Crowley came to insist that these drugs be left severely alone until or unless you knew what you were doing. Experiment, yes, but with care. Again and again, this caution is insisted upon in no uncertain terms in dozens of different writings. In fact, I wish these works on drugs were better known to the contemporary scene, for what he had to say could serve as a guide into the unknown and immeasurable regions of the mind and spirit. For a reprint of his essays about hashish, with an acute analysis of mystical states in terms of the Buddhist skandhas, the reader should consult the book Roll Away the Stone. Some of the letters in Magick Without Tears are particularly pertinent to this theme, where these topics are handled simply and directly and intelligently. For example, in letter 78 entitled Sore Spots, he makes some priceless contributions to the triad of drugs, sex, and religion, which no one can afford to leave unread. There are many such references. I was profoundly impressed by this particular letter. He was no flower child, dedicated to peace at any price. Though squeamish in all sorts of ways, he was yet capable of lashing out, shooting someone, or poking them in the nose. Violence for him was as much a part of life as peace and quiet. Modern pacifism would have repelled him altogether. He had made it a rule of his life to expose himself to all sorts of dangerous situations in which violence was implicit and in which he reveled. Read The Smoking Dog, a chapter from The Book of Lies, quoted in one of these letters. It clarifies his point of view with force and simplicity. Love and death are likened to the two hounds of God that pursue man, who must ultimately turn and use them. Make love, not war, certainly would win his approval, but then he might insist on changing the word not and replacing it with and. The book of the law serves as his authority here, governing his every attitude and moral outlook. It gives vast prominence to love under will. But its third and final chapter makes no attempt to soften the hammer blows of violence. Now let it be first understood that I am a God of war and of vengeance. I shall deal hardly with them. This is the message of Ra Hor Kuit, the third of the divinities involved in Liber Legis, Nuit and Hadit being the other two. Mercy let be off, damn them who pity. Kill and torture, spare not, be upon them. Many of the letters contain commentaries and interpretations of some of the more enigmatical parts of the book, and it thus becomes a goldmine of information. Soon, Liber Legis will be republished by Llewellyn Publications, together with Crowley's protracted commentary that took years in writing, under the title, The Law is for All. I think it is an urgent necessity at this time. But even in these letters comprising Magick without tears, there are some fine gems of interpretation that should not be missed. 4. Finally, he was capable of what most present day hippies are not: self discipline. His entire life is a dynamic testimonial to that fact, demonstrating the practice of the disciplines of meditation and magic, often without supervision. They transformed him so that when the great illuminations occurred toward the end of the first decade of this century, he coined a Latin motto which, translated, meant, "In my lifetime, I have conquered the universe by the force of truth." Even then, he was not through with his self discipline. During World War II, when he was in the United States, he pursued, stubbornly and steadfastly, spiritual and magical disciplines, which he mastered, all as described in extant diaries. His contempt for the undisciplined mob, lolling around on street corners and curbs, is enough to dissipate any possibility of describing him as a Victorian hippie. On the contrary, the moderns, whether hippies or not, need him tremendously, and what he has to offer could possibly redeem them. The end of his letter 45 is an adequate reminder of what he stood for. To advance, that means work. Patient, exhausting, thankless, often bewildering work. Dear sister, if you would but work blindly, foolishly, misguidedly, it doesn't matter in the end. Work in itself has absolute virtue. Of course, the work that he refers to is spiritual work, meditation, yoga, magic, in all phases and varieties. Work, not intellectualization. In the footnote to that same letter, he gives a quick rundown of some of his attitudes and early experiences where work is concerned, so that his correspondent might not run away with the idea that he was preaching what he had not practiced. His occult biography, The Temple of Solomon the King, serialized throughout all the 10 numbers of the Equinox, gives ample evidence of his persistence and fidelity where the great work was concerned. Above all, Notice the remarks at the beginning of letter 45. The ideas expressed there are, in reality, at the heart of his system of training and development. The chiding he administers to his correspondent is not nearly as severe as he has been known to give himself. Throughout these letters are innumerable references to the equinox. To the younger students of today, the equinox may convey but little until he attempts to purchase one or more of them. He will find it all but impossible. Even if he succeeds in tracking some of them down, he will discover that the tag attached to them bears an exorbitant price. I have heard only recently of a set of the 11 volumes being sold for $500. For this reason, the William Publications will be republishing selected writings from the Equinox, entitled Gems from the Equinox, which falls within a price range which is compatible with the pocketbook of most students. But what are these books? Between 1909 and 1914, Aleister Crowley published in England a large, beautifully printed periodical. The masthead on the cover bore two phrases: the aim of religion and the method of science. This periodical contained a wide assortment of verse, plays, short stories, and miscellaneous occult material. One issue appeared every 6 months, at the spring and autumn equinoxes of that 5-year period. 10 enormous issues appeared in all. After 1914, there was a hiatus of 5 years, corresponding to World War I, when Crowley was domiciled in the U.S. He called it a 5-year period of silence, which was ultimately broken by the appearance of another large volume bound in blue cloth, called colloquially the Blue Equinox. No others were published. There was no more money available. By students of occultism, these volumes were regarded as veritable goldmine of occult lore. Most who bought them were far less interested in the wide literary assortment offered. Yoga and magic were what these books stood for, and this is where the Equinox excelled. There was simply nothing like them elsewhere. In these instructions about the occult arts, Crowley used superb prose and clarified the subject matter by eliminating all the superstition, dross, and fantasy that had been attached to these subjects. They were masterpieces of instruction. It was for these reasons that the 11 volumes of The Equinox were so zealously sought after throughout the years. In letter 75, Crowley has written a word or two about what he intended to accomplish in these books. What he has to say is so interesting that the following is quoted from that letter. My special job was to preserve the sacred tradition, so that a new renaissance might in due season rekindle the hidden light. I was accordingly to make a quintessence of the ancient wisdom and publish it in as permanent a form as possible. This I did in the Equinox. I should perhaps have been strictly classical and admitted only the publication in Class A, AB, B, and D material. But I had the idea that it would be a good plan to add all sorts of other stuff so that people who are not in any way interested in the real work might preserve their copies. They, the secret chiefs of the order, were agreed on measures calculated to assure the survival of the wisdom worth saving until the time, perhaps 300 or 600 years later, when a new current should revive the shattered thought of mankind. The equinox, in a word, was to be a sort of Rosetta Stone. It appears that he recognized that he should have published only the basic yoga and magical instructions known as the official instructions of the order in order to preserve the sacred tradition. Now that the original sets of the Equinox are out of circulation, there were only 1,000 sets printed. It seems necessary to reissue the fundamental material that he had in mind at the beginning, the official instructions. Thus, gems from the Equinox consist solely of those. If it was the wish of the so-called secret chiefs of the order to preserve the practical wisdom of the hidden sanctuaries against the disasters of war, natural cataclysms, and famine, all of which now seem clearly in the offing. I hope that the issuance of Gems from the Equinox will assist in the fulfillment of the original intent, freed from the addition of all sorts of other stuff. For, thus freed, this set of reprints of the official publications of the AA now coincides with what appears to have been Crowley's original intent as expressed in Magick Without Tears. Magick Without Tears demanded that some careful pruning be done. I have exercised great caution and deliberation in the editing, if only because I am fully aware of the fanatical attitude of some of Crowley's disciples. Every word that he wrote must have been endowed with some divine quality and must not be tampered with. So runs their belief. It is quite irrational. Crowley himself would have been first to admit this, though he has often admitted that he was altogether incapable of editing his own material. The only thing ever to issue from his pen, which he demanded must never be edited, was a group of select writings called the Holy Books, and above all, the Book of the Law. Change not so much as the style of a letter. What I have deleted is mostly rambling, or repetitious statements, a few quotations from Robert Browning, none of which in any case interfere with the meaning of any particular passage. This is then the cardinal rule that is applied at all times during the surgical intervention to the text of these letters. Nothing has been changed that might alter his free flow of ideas or the intrinsic meaning of the communication. Thus, the bulk of the volume has been reduced, but has been tightened up considerably, thus making for easier reading. There were a few letters so complete and firmly written that no editing was required in the least. Stray bits of revealing insight without parallel elsewhere shine here and there. For example, he is almost at his best in letter 20 on the significance of lamens and talismans and panacles. It is worth comparing his clarity here with some earlier elucidations, notably the delightful Part 2 of Book 4, or In Magic and Theory and Practice. Invariably, it turns out that no real comparison can be made, though in these letters there is a maturity and clarity that is not found in either of the books just mentioned. Again, when he discusses gods and angels, he is so direct and matter of fact as to be altogether impressive. He makes no attempt to be sanctimonious, otherworldly, or guru like, but deals with abstruse problems easily, without being afraid to say occasionally, I don't know. One is impressed by his honesty and forthrightness. There is no other writer on this subject today who can hold a candle to him. Another matter touched upon in these letters is a phenomenon that is current today. Groups of young people are breaking away from the mainstream of society, or the so-called establishment, to form little communes which they hope will be free from the disease which they see attacking society. They want none of it. They have high ideals, believing it possible to form utopias of one kind or another where corruption, hypocrisy, and deceit will be unable to flourish. There are hundreds of such communes all over the country, all searching for a utopia. I have no patience whatever with utopia mongers, wrote Crowley. Biology simply shouts at us that the happy, contented community, everyone with his own, often highly specialized job, nobody in need, nobody in danger, is necessarily stagnant. Termites and other ants, bees, beavers, these and many another have produced perfect systems. What is the first characteristic? Stupidity. Where there is no vision, the people shall perish. What is the fighter termite to do after he has been blocked out of his home? None of these communities possess any resource at all against any unforeseen, unfavorable change of circumstance, nor does any one of them show any achievement. Having got to the end of their biological tether, they stay put without an aim, an idea, an effort. If the utopian community or ideal is unworkable, what then are the conditions of progress? Number one is obviously irregularity, eccentricity, disorder, the revolutionary spirit, experiment. These are obviously characteristics of Crowley himself as a person, and so we should expect him to project these as being the prerequisites for progress. His description of the so called crazy adventurer who embodies these characteristics, or the holy man, should also be read in conjunction with that lengthy section of the Book of Thoth, which describes in great detail the several interpretations of the tarot card, the Fool. It may facilitate also some understanding of how he finally came to conceive of himself. On several occasions, he has essayed this task, not only in this fascinating book of letters and in the book about the tarot, but in his earlier book, Magick in Theory and Practice. It is far from easy for the ordinary individual, bound by the ordinary codes of social behavior and the conventional frames of reference, to have the foggiest idea of what moves or motivates an initiate, whose illumination has imposed an entirely new point of view on the world and in life in general. The whole of letter 79 on progress should be read in this connection. It is also interesting to compare some of the weird historical facts quoted in letter 48 and others regarding Adolf Hitler, Sorrow, IWE, and the Book of the Law with some of the fairy stories and fantasies spun in a relatively recent book entitled The Dawn of Magic. Some editions have entitled it The Morning of the Magicians by Lewis Powells and Jacques Berger. I have to admit that some of the material in that book about Hitler's goals and behavior is interesting, even if almost incredible. But some of the material relative to the history of the Golden Dawn is so far out, so historically false, as to make one doubt the veracity of other ideas with which one may be less familiar. It thus makes one doubt the validity of what the authors state about the Hitler theme and several others. However, some of the references in Magick Without Tears to Hitler and Sorrow IWE's foolish attempts to get Hitler to adopt Liber Legis as his personal code to foist upon Germany and then mankind are enough to make one pause. In conclusion, I should add that the foreword to this book was written by Carl Germer. He was Crowley's representative in America and his successor as outer head of the Ordo Templi Orientis. The foreword describes in part how this collection of letters came into being. Aleister Crowley wrote the introduction, which consists of several preliminary letters, paving the way for the remaining ones. I have written the preface to highlight some of the more outstanding contents of the book, which ought not to be missed. Did any book ever have so many messengers as this one? I hope they will not be confusing to the reader, but that all of them will somehow conduce to his further and deeper understanding. Israel Regarde, June 6, 1970, Studio City, California.